Well, just last month, I had the honor and the privilege of officiating the wedding of Douglas UCC's own Annie Hot Wagner and Marty Coffin, who actually are in Florida right now. But right after the wedding, they gave me this really great gift. It is a beautiful sign which says, Namaste. And as many of you know, I conclude my messages each and every Sunday here by saying this beautiful Sanskrit word. And a reminder to those of you who have been hearing this word, it means the divine light that is within me recognizes and honors the divine light that is within you. And I just think it's the perfect word because it's really what the spiritual path is all about. It's about discovering the light within yourself and then recognizing it in everyone else. Such a beautiful word. And believe it or not, there is a UCC church in Chicago whose name is Namaste UCC. Don't you love it? The pastor of Namaste UCC, her name is Reverend Marilyn Pagan Banks. She is also the director of an organization in Chicago called A Just Harvest, which provides meals for the hungry in Chicago. And in a blog post this week that the UCC shared, Reverend Banks talks about how the organization used to be called Good News Community Kitchen. And when they changed their name to A Just Harvest, one of the sponsors called her up and said, I've been giving money to this organization because I believe Jesus instructed us to feed the poor. But now I'm concerned that you're changing it to A Just Harvest. This just wouldn't have to do with this justice stuff because I don't want to get into this justice stuff. What did Jesus have to do with justice? And Reverend Banks, of course, answered beautifully, and she said, Jesus had everything to do with justice. And in that blog post this week, she wrote, yes, Jesus fed the hungry and calls us to do the same. But Jesus also called out the systems and the structures that kept people hungry and poor. The powers that be, they were pretty okay with Jesus feeding people. But the minute he began to question them, agitate them, turn over tables, and call them into account, that is when he became a risk, and that is when he got killed. Jesus was political. Breaking bread with women and tax collectors was a political act. Healing on the Sabbath was a political act. Turning over tables of exploitation was a political act. Riding into Jerusalem was a political act. Jesus embodied his faith, and that was political. Now, I share this with you today in light of today's gospel passage where Jesus says, render to the emperor, render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and render to God what is God's. Many people think that what Jesus was saying was, keep your faith and politics separate. Is that really what he was saying? Well, we know our founding fathers made that pretty clear, this separation of church and state. If you were with us on the Sunday of July 4th weekend this year, that's what my message was all about how America was not founded as a Christian nation, and that our founding fathers explicitly excluded the word God from the Constitution. The word God appears nowhere in the Constitution, not one time. So people say, well, what about in God we trust on our paper currency? Well, that happened in the 1950s. It was around the same time that the words in our Pledge of Allegiance, one nation under God, were added in the 1950s. Now, many people in this room were alive in the 1950s, so it wasn't that long ago. And in this lifetime, the lines between church and state have become blurred. They continue to become more and more blurred. This year, we saw a group of very influential and powerful evangelical Christian pastors in a circle surrounding our president with their hands on his shoulders, praying for him in the middle of the Oval Office. And this week, our president spoke not at one, but at two evangelical Christian conferences. So are we to mix politics and religion or not? What exactly did Jesus mean by render to Caesar what is Caesar's and render to God what is God's? Well, if you've been with us for the past 4 weeks now, you know that the lectionary readings every Sunday are the Pharisees trying to trick Jesus. And Jesus beautifully responds. Jesus is really bold in this passage. He calls them hypocrites. Jesus has been challenging their authority. He's been questioning their authority. He's been speaking truth to power. And so they try to trick him with a question. They say, should we pay taxes or not? And how can he really answer? If he says, well, yes, you should pay taxes, they'll say to the crowd, see, he supports the emperor. And if Jesus says, no, don't pay taxes, they'll say, okay, lock up this guy for treason. So he can't really win, but he does something beautiful, as he always does. He responds to their question with a question. And he says to them, give me a coin. Whose face and whose words are on this coin? Give to that guy what's his, and give to God what is God's. He answers their question with a question and gets them to think. Now, all of us in this room pay taxes. And as Bishop John Shelby Spong, one of the leading voices in progressive Christianity, reminded us this morning in our words of integration, that we pay taxes even if we know that a portion of those taxes is going to fund things that we don't believe in. That is just one of the duties that we do for living in a country that is so free. But he also reminded us that rendering to Caesar what is Caesar's is much more than just about paying taxes. He says, I also believe it is my duty as a Christian to bear public witness against the policies that Caesar adopts when these policies violate all that I consider holy. We owe the Caesars in every generation a call to truth when truth is violated, a call to responsibility when incompetence is displayed, and a call to morality when evil is rampant. The time has come for us to render to Caesar what is due to Caesar. And Bishop Spong tells us that that is the role of the prophet. The prophecy isn't about predicting the future. What it means to be a prophet is to speak uncomfortable truths to people in power. That's what Jesus did. And if we're to call ourselves followers of Jesus, we have to do the same. So yes, we have to pay taxes, even though we know those taxes might go to fund an unjust war that we don't believe in. But also part of Jesus' admonition this morning is that we're also called to speak truth, to speak out against that unjust war, to speak for justice and truth and peace. So that's what he meant, to render to Caesar what is Caesar's, but to render to God what is God's. Makes sense? Jesus wasn't saying to keep them separate. He was saying that it is a responsibility on our part. Jesus was political. Now, there's a wonderful book out by Reza Aslan, which is called Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth. And if you get our weekly epistle newsletter each week, this week I had a quote from that book. And the quote said, "There's absolutely no difference between religion and politics at all in Jesus' time. Every seemingly religious word that came out of Jesus' mouth had a very clear and unmistakable political connotation to it." Jesus was political. That's what got him killed. Do you think they killed him because he was just so nice? He was just so nice, feeding people and spreading love. Why would they kill him for that? Now, I see a lot of Christians today who are very nice. They feed the poor, they give their money to charity, but then they support and vote for policies that keep people poor. They vote and support policies and politicians that work to hurt sick people. And they support policies that keep the stranger out. That's not the way of Jesus. Of course, doing this, speaking our truth to power, is dangerous. Jesus was persecuted, and we will face persecution. That's what our first reading this morning was all about from Thessalonians. Paul is writing the Thessalonians because they, the early Christians, were being persecuted by the empire for following the way of Jesus. And Paul is writing them to encourage them, to say, even though you're being persecuted, rejoice, for you are doing what Jesus instructed, speaking truth. Now, I know there are people in this room who have shared with me that because you have spoken your truth this year, you have lost family members and friends. And Jesus says, if you follow my way of life, you must leave behind mother, father, sister, brother, everything. You must give everything to this. Your all. That's what this means, to render to God what is God's. What is God's? You. You're of God. So you are to give your all to God. That's what it means to render to God. To give your all, to give everything, your voice, your heart, your soul, your worries, your fears, all of yourself, you give to God. That's what Jesus is saying in today's gospel. I'd like to conclude my talk this morning not with my words, but with the words of Reverend Banks from the Namaste UCC. To truly be the church requires that we're not afraid to claim our voice in the political arena. Like Jesus, the church must be willing and able to take risks in order to bring about real transformation and to be about the work of building the kingdom. The church was never meant to be a nice hiding place from the world, but a space from which we could resist, persist, and insist that the love of God be made manifest in our policies, our laws, our marketplaces, and in our government. So, let us insist, resist, and persist. Namaste.